this is where you should be living during the season when you're building DFS lineups. So much work and man hours goes into these projections. I think the average fantasy gamer kind of underestimates that, especially if you are coming from just like a redraft sort of background. Yeah, I just would really not underestimate the projections. They're the best tool that you have for DFS, for prop betting.
No, absolutely. And I think like a lot of people listening to this are probably wondering like, oh, are Ryan Heath's favorite angles from advanced matchups counted in here? Like, yes, absolutely. You know, Ryan meets with us every week on Fridays. We talk about our projections. We talk about our biggest stands. Scott Barrett's biggest stands are baked in here. You know, I feel like every projections meeting, Scott will be like, why don't we have Derrick Henry projected for 35 DraftKings points? And we explain why that's not possible, but maybe we could bump him up by a point or two to, you know, sort of bake that take in there. So that's another important thing to remember, is that when you're reading our articles, all of our strongest takes from our articles are baked into these median projections.
Welcome to this off-season edition of DFS Deep Dive, where our experts pull back the curtain on how they and you can leverage all our tools at Fantasy Points DFS to level up your process and make money. I'm Ryan Heath, joined today by Jake Tribbey, and today we're going to talk about all the quirks of DraftKings scoring format, including everything a new player needs to know to get caught up and start finding an edge on the competition. We'll show you how to use our projections, which were the most accurate in the industry for 2025, and we'll discuss the positional and player archetype strategy stemming from all of this that you should keep in mind when you are building those lineups. But first, I've got to tell you that if you want access to those most accurate projections in the industry, all of our DFS content like Scott Barrett's Slate Breakdown, Ryan Heath, myself's Advanced Matchups, and UFL DFS content and projections from Jake Tribbey, the best spring football analyst in the world, you've got to go to fantasypoints.com/plans and use code DFS at checkout through the end of March 2027. That will give you access to every single DFS article and tool from our team designed to help you win. And we know it works. We've had a subscriber win the Millie Maker during each of the past 3 years. Again, use code DFS at checkout. So getting into DraftKings scoring here, if you've played in a regular fantasy league before at the office or with your buddies, and if that league had point per reception or PPR type scoring, this is going to look pretty familiar to you. But I'm going to turn it over to you here, Jake. You have the screen share up here showing all of the scoring. What kind of sticks out to you most when you're playing on DraftKings, and what do you think people need to be aware of if they're maybe jumping into DFS for the first time?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between DraftKings scoring and PPR scoring are the 3-point bonuses that you get as a quarterback for having over a 300-yard passing game, or as a rusher for going over 100 yards, or as a receiver for also going over 100 yards. So that's half of a touchdown, half of a rushing or receiving touchdown, 3/4 of a passing touchdown for hitting that bonus. That's a fairly big note. And then the other major change relative to standard PPR scoring is, from what I've seen, or from what I understand, most leagues will penalize you 2 points for an interception or a fumble. On DraftKings, they only penalize you 1 point. So turnovers are not as big of a deal on DraftKings, but the really big thing to keep in mind here are the 3-point bonuses for 300 passing yards, 100 rushing yards, or 100 receiving yards.
Yeah, good point on the turnovers there. But yeah, those bonuses are kind of interesting because in a way, they make touchdowns matter a little bit less. It rewards kind of these bigger yardage totals, but it does it like very awkwardly and specifically at that 100-yard marker. So adds a little bit more variance, but I do think in general makes it more important to be targeting players, targeting offenses, and especially game environments that can kind of go into these back and forth shootouts are going to get up to those bigger yardage totals. But yeah, that's really all there is to it. Just keeping in mind the bonuses, I think, is really the biggest thing for new people. And you might say, okay, well, how can I do that? There's all of these scoring rules. What is like the best way to just understand what each player could score based on them? And we've got you covered at Fantasy Points because every single week we put out projections. I say we put out projections. Really, all the credit goes to Chris Wecht. He is our projections maestro, commander-in-chief of projections at Fantasy Points. Projects out every single game for every single week during the regular season and the NFL playoffs. And it basically gives you a median outcome to work off of for every single player, customized to all of these DraftKings scoring settings. We're recording this before the Super Bowl. So right now, Jake just flipped over to our projections page on fantasypoints.com. And as you can see, we've just got this median projection for every single player. It's the Super Bowl right now. During the season, it would show you every single player on the main slate or on the Thursday through Monday slate or whichever slate you want to pick. Just you can also, first we should start here. This is where you should be living during the season when you're building DFS lineups. In the top right there, you can download our projections if you want to get them into a CSV, send them anywhere else to your optimizer of choice or what have you. You can sort by salary. You can also sort by fantasy points per dollar, which is exactly what it sounds like, just how valuable a player's projection is relative to their salary. Higher fantasy point per dollar values generally are just going to be, quote unquote, better values. You're getting more fantasy points on average for the salary there. Anything else you want to point out kind of on this page, Jake, before we get into the more detailed stat by stat projections that we have on another page?
I think you did a really good job of covering it. I think the only other note that I would have is that if you are looking at our projections for Showdown, the salary displayed will be the player's flex salary. So there's a 1.5 times salary multiplier for the captain spot there. So that's something to keep in mind. Really doesn't change the value calculations or anything. But just something to keep in mind when you're looking at this page.
And the only other thing is you can also toggle between DraftKings and FanDuel on this page or on any of our projections pages if you wanted to play on FanDuel. But now we are going to move over into the weekly projections page so you can see some of the detailed stat by stat breakdowns that go into each of these numbers. This is going to be useful if you're happening to use our projections for prop betting, whatever. If you want to bet the over on Drake May passing yards, you can see what our median projection is for passing yards right there. If you filter between different positions, you'll see rushing yards, receiving yards for receivers, everything you would expect there. And of course, kind of one of the bigger points here is that DFS is very ruled by touchdowns. Generally, the guys that are scoring multiple touchdowns, those are going to be the guys that are optimal in any given week on any given slate. We have those touchdown projections as well that you can kind of view as touchdown odds. Jackson Smith-Njigba, we have projected for 0.7 of a receiving touchdown. That implies pretty high odds that he is going to catch a receiving touchdown in this game, for example. Anything else here, Jake, that you kind of want to point out for people that might be jumping into DFS using our projections?
Yeah, I mean, our projections are great. Like Ryan said, introing this show, the most accurate projections in the industry in the 2025 regular season. And if you want to prop bet profitably, that starts with using great median projections. So these are a fantastic resource for anyone who's betting, or if you just kind of want to understand how we arrived at certain numbers for DFS projections, looking through these weekly numbers and seeing that we have JSN projected for over 100 receiving yards helps make his 23-point DraftKings projection make a little bit more sense. So those would really be my only notes on this page.
Yeah, if you have guys that are close to that 100-yard bonus, that can be really good to note too, like knowing who realistically are the guys most likely to hit those bonuses is kind of something that's nice. Yeah, and I guess the only other thing I would say is that so much work and man hours goes into these projections. I think the average fantasy gamer kind of underestimates that, especially if you are coming from just like a redraft sort of background. Projections in your mind might be like, oh, that's the thing on the fantasy app that are never right, or that say I have a 70% chance to win when I don't win. Yes, they are not going to be perfect, but this is like the best method kind of repeated across every single player that we can get to, play DFS, work all of these ranges of outcomes. Our entire DFS team sits down and reviews these projections every single week during the season. They incorporate all of the information and content that we're kind of putting together. So I just would really not underestimate the projections. They're the best tool that you have for DFS, for prop betting. I would even argue for setting like your seasonal fantasy lineups.
Yeah.
Really, really good stuff.
No, absolutely. And I think like a lot of people listening to this are probably wondering like, oh, are Ryan Heath's favorite angles from advanced matchups counted in here? Like, yes, absolutely. You know, Ryan meets with us every week on Fridays. We talk about our projections. We talk about our biggest stands. Scott Barrett's biggest stands are baked in here. You know, I feel like every projections meeting, Scott will be like, why don't we have Derrick Henry projected for 35 DraftKings points? And we explain why that's not possible, but maybe we could bump him up by a point or two to, you know, sort of bake that take in there. So that's another important thing to remember, is that when you're reading our articles, all of our strongest takes from our articles are baked into these median projections.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be very easy to double count that, but I would try not to. If you are working from our projections to build a DFS lineup set and you really liked that take that I had about AJ Brown in that particular week, I understand that we're probably the highest on AJ Brown in the industry in that type of scenario.
Yeah, and speaking of double counting, Ryan, another thing that I think is very important to note is every sort of weather element that could matter for a football game is also baked into these projections. So, you know, Vegas totals, Vegas lines incorporate weather. Those are baked into our projections, and then we also incorporate weather independently of that. So, our projections really do account for everything. In Discord, you'll often see, especially later in the season on Sunday morning, people will be asking, oh, you know, the weather report in Chicago looks pretty bad. Should I be changing anything based on my process? Our projections are already factoring all that in. So if you're using our projections, just be sure to not double count something like weather.
Yep, awesome point, and something that we repeat constantly, but it is something that can be hard to remember just kind of emotionally when you're sitting there making lineups and seeing the weather reports. So moving past kind of these projections, the DraftKings scoring, I want to just talk a little bit of strategy, how this kind of plays out in practice with you, Jake. So just really talking about what players and types of positions these scoring settings tend to benefit when it comes to actually building lineups, what we're thinking about. Probably the easiest way to discuss this is through the lens of what position should you play in the flex? Which positions are between running back, wide receiver, and tight end among the flex eligible positions on DraftKings are going to score the most fantasy points? Who should you be playing there? Talk to me, Jake, at least based on 2025 and the trends that we saw. Where have you been leaning most recently when it comes to your flex exposure?
Yeah, so flex exposure, I would say, is very dependent on the week. Early in the season, you will see players are priced down sort of across the board. So it's a lot easier to fit in a lot of the best players in the NFL into your lineup. So especially early in the season, you will see flex plays will generally be the strongest that they are all year, because you'll have these 6K running backs or 6,500 running backs who are earning like bell cow type workloads. And those are pretty easy guys to fit in because even the expensive receivers that you're playing don't cost that much. Later in the season, as like the elite guys, the Puka Nakuas, the Christian McCaffreys, the Bijan Robinsons get priced up, things get a little tighter. And all of a sudden, to fit those guys in your lineup, you need to start going cheap in the flex fairly often. Not every time. Again, this is very week dependent, but I found myself, at least in 2025, playing a lot of tight end end in the flex, really just punting with like a $3,500 tight end. I think Michael Mayer later in the season is like the best possible example, where when Brock Bowers went down, this is a $3,500 tight end who we're projecting for 7, 8, 9 targets because the team's going to be down the entire time. They don't really have much receiving talent. So I think he's a pretty good example. And then the other example that I wanted to give is there will be weeks where it just so happens that, 2 or 3 starting running backs are out, and we can very confidently project their backups for bell cow workloads. So there were a handful of weeks this season, even later in the year, where you're getting 3 or 4 running backs who are under 6K who all project very, very well because the starter or the guy they're in a committee with is out. So in that case, you're playing a running back in the flex. But again, it's very week dependent. I wouldn't, always play a tight end or always play a wide receiver or running back in the flex. It depends on your specific lineup. It depends on the week. It depends on the pricing dynamics of the week. But just looking at last year, those were sort of some of the trends that I saw.
Yeah, I do think the PPR scoring kind of makes it possible to do tight end in the flex and to feel better about it, at least from a projection standpoint. If not for that, it becomes very difficult, especially the punt plays like the Michael Mayers of the world, where they're on kind of worse teams, not necessarily a lot of touchdown equity. If not for that PPR element, it would be very hard to kind of punt with those types of plays. But yeah, I think that you put it pretty beautifully. The scoring is balanced enough that it depends so heavily on the slate and the pricing for that slate in particular. I think ideally I want to get running backs in the flex. That's like my first kind of impulse is, can I fit a running back in the flex? But very often it becomes, no, I can't. I need to go down to a cheaper wide receiver, a cheaper punt tight end in certain cases. So yeah, good discussion there. Let's talk about the running back position a little bit more in depth and how the PPR scoring kind of influences it, as well as the bonuses, honestly, because I would say that out of any position, I think about running back the most differently in DFS compared to like seasonal formats. So normally you would think, okay, you want the pass catching running backs if it's full PPR, maybe not like the satellite backs back in the like 2015 to 2018 times in the NFL, when we had all of these satellite running backs that projected for 5 to 6 catches and not many receptions, or excuse me, not many carries every single game. But at least like the 3 down bell cows we should want in DFS. And that is largely true. But I do think in DFS, the Derrick Henrys and the James Cooks of the world are a lot more viable than you might expect if you are just coming from like a redraft sort of background. So talk to me a little bit, Jake, about why we want to play these 2 down workhorses at least some of the time in DFS, despite kind of the PPR scoring making you think things should be tilted against them.
Yeah, so in a standard league with PPR scoring, season long type league, you're playing Derrick Henry every single week because you drafted him in the 2nd, maybe 3rd round, and he's just your best running back option. Some of those weeks, though, Baltimore's going to be getting blown out, or maybe they have negative game script, and they're not going to be able to feed Derrick Henry like they would in a week where they would have positive game script. So I think that's the real key with some of these early down workhorses, is that we can just pick our spots. Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, in these games where their teams are favored by 5, 6, 7 points, maybe more, those are the really, really strong spots to play players like that. And I mean, Ryan, we have a ton of historical data on this. Derrick Henry's a guy who's 50% more productive in wins. James Cook, Jonathan Taylor, quite similar. And I think another important note when it comes to these running backs is that extreme success on the ground is generally correlated with positive game script, which means you can combine that running back with their defense, because if a team's playing with the lead, that generally means their defense is doing a pretty good job. Or extreme success on the ground is also correlated with just general offensive success. If a team's playing with the lead, it means their team is putting up points. So playing those workhorses, even though it's a little counterintuitive with their quarterbacks or within onslaught stacks, especially on shorter slates, like a 4-game slate, maybe a 6-game early only slate, that's something that works really well and is something that I tend to do a lot. But yeah, I do think that's an important note when it comes to DFS for the running back position.
Yeah, and it's not that like the Christian McCaffreys and the Bijan Robinsons aren't also awesome in DFS. They very often are, especially if they're in solid game environments. But yeah, just because we can week to week, we can just pick exactly when you want to play Derrick Henry when he's up against the Bengals as a 7-point favorite. It just becomes a very different type of game with those players. It's almost like they're quote unquote better in best ball, but they're better in DFS because you get to choose exactly which weeks you want to deploy them. So
yeah, exactly. And my last final note on that, Ryan, is that when it comes to guys who catch a ton of passes but are on these bad offenses, I think it's a little easy to sort of overestimate their upside. And the example that I love to give here is 2024 Alvin Kamara, where he had the best workload of any running back in fantasy measured by expected fantasy points per game. But the Saints offense just wasn't very good. He wasn't getting in scoring opportunities very often, despite a ton of games with 7, 8, 9, 10 targets. Kamara only exceeded 25 DraftKings points twice in that entire season. So that's another important thing to keep in mind, is that guys like Derrick Henry, guys like James Cook, there's a little bit more volatility in their scores, but the big scores are generally much bigger than the guys who are like strong pass catching running backs and play in offenses that don't generate a ton of yards.
Yeah, this is the entire reason that I tweet out every single week the red zone expected fantasy points, specifically as like a little chart on Twitter. It's just red zone expected versus actual fantasy points. And it's just to see, okay, yes, these are the running backs that specifically have really good red zone roles that can, in a single game, roll into multiple touchdowns, like a high-end DFS outcome that we want to be interested in. Because, yeah, that Alvin Kamara year, the Saints just weren't getting into the red zone very much was the entire problem. He did not have the touchdown equity you might expect of a typical bell cow running back. So the only other kind of player archetype thing I want to go over in regards to the DraftKings PPR scoring is the PPR scam slot wide receiver. Khalil Shakir is the name we probably most pick on in this way. It was Wan'Dale Robinson for a little while. Jake, you and I both are very often like critical of these guys and say that we're not playing them. Do you just want to kind of lay out why that's the case, despite what you might think, hey, it's PPR, you want these types of guys in seasonal leagues, or at least they're a bit more valuable there. Why is that not the case in DFS?
Yeah, so a guy like Khalil Shakir, who has an extremely low average depth of target and does earn a good number of targets, provides you with a great floor and, generally will score pretty close to his median. These are also guys that tend to project pretty well, so it's often tempting to see, oh, Khalil Shakir's projecting as a top 5, top 8 value this week. He's a guy I should play. You look through the game logs, though, and at least for tournaments, there's really just no upside here. Shakir has 0 games over 25 DraftKings points in the last 2 seasons, and a big part of that is because, as we noted earlier in the show with these 3-point bonuses, Shakir's just never hitting them. A good game for Khalil Shakir might be 60 yards, 6-7 catches, maybe a touchdown. I mean, he's not a guy who plays a ton in the red zone, doesn't get a lot of red zone looks. So, the upside case there isn't fantastic, and I think with him and with these low ADOT, scam PPR guys, the real question, and the question that you have to ask yourself, is can this guy put up a score where, when I'm looking at the standings later on Sunday, I absolutely had to have him? And the answer, at least with guys who get a lot of designed work, get a lot of low ADOT stuff, is generally no.
Yeah, I think this is maybe one of the biggest weaknesses of projections. If I were to make like a critique of just the concept of relying on projections for DFS, there are a handful of these guys where, yeah, they're going to project for a large share of their team's targets, 25 to 30% or whatever for Khalil Shakir. Jakobi Meyers is another example where it's constantly like, yeah, if you're projecting out his entire team, you have to give this amount of work to Jakobi Meyers. It's going to be a lot of receptions. Those PPR points are going to add up. But very rarely are you getting to like a convincing 95th percentile outcome where he's actually winning you a tournament. So yeah, projections are medians, and it's good to understand that not every player has the same type of range of outcomes around that median. Some of these these like higher average depth of target, more downfield usage receivers have a way wider range of outcomes. They can get much further beyond their median projection than somebody like a Khalil Shakir or Jacoby Myers. So that's all I had to say on this, Jake. Is there anything that you wanted to leave the people with before I got us out of here?
No, Ryan, I think these were great notes.
Awesome. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, guys, on DFS Deep Dive. If what Jake and I have discussed intrigues you and has gotten you excited to step into the world of Fantasy Points DFS, again, you can head over to fantasypoints.com and subscribe for the upcoming season with promo code DFS. Again, our Fantasy Pro package runs through March 2027. It'll give you access to all our projections, tools, and content for both the upcoming UFL spring football season, which starts in late March, and the entire NFL 2026 season. And it'll even get you into our subscriber Discord, where you can talk directly to me, to Jake, to Scott Barrett, and to all of our analysts, answer any of your questions. Or you could even go for the Fantasy Bundle subscription, which gives you access to all of that, plus the Fantasy Points data suite, college football coverage, and our Ball Knowledge AI tool. So have a wonderful rest of your day, guys, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboard.
What's up?